This conference will now be recorded.
Yeah, let us wait for a minute. Oh, two more or three more should join. They might have confusion as they shared new link. Right? Yeah, so let us start. So we are discussing the Spring Core module, right? We are discussing Spring Core, and here we are talking about our IOC containers. Like Core is the base module, okay? Came along with Spring Core jar file, Spring Core jar, and Spring context jar. These two jars are having almost all the Spring Core features, Spring Core and Spring context. These jar files are Spring Framework jar files. These two jar files are Spring Framework jar files. The Spring Framework internally using Commons logging. Commons logging jar also they are using. Okay. Commons logging jar they are using internally. Frameworks also can have their own dependencies. They can have dependencies while they are building their framework. So this framework, Spring Core framework is having Commons logging dependency. So this jar file also we need to include. So along with this jar files, we have Spring Core features. Like in J2SE, we use runtime jar file, right? RT jar file. There we have collections, dependencies, everything, right? Similar way, here in the Spring Core jar file, we have all the Spring Core features, which is IOC, your container, IOC containers. We have containers here. Using these containers, we can deploy our application, complete end-to-end application we can deploy and we can run. So this is the great container support we have from the Spring Core. So using container, what we generally do, we run all our POSOs. POSOs means your controller classes, right? Your services, DAOs, right? Any utility classes, transactions, whatever it is, all your classes, all your MVC classes, whatever you implement, all the classes in your application, right? If you call this as a application, we call this as a application, all your classes. Consider you have a class A, POSO class, B POSO class, C POSO class, D, E, all your POSOs. We need to create all classes as POSO classes in our application. These classes you can run on your IOC container. You can configure these POSOs. So whatever number of POSOs you can have for building your application, whatever number of POSOs you can have, all these classes we finally configure into a XML file. All our classes we configure into a XML. Okay, we configure into XML, Spring XML file, and here we configure our A bean, B class bean, C class, D class, whatever number of classes you have. All that beans we configure in our Spring XML file. Finally, we load this into our IOC container. So we'll write one more class, application class. We'll write one more class with main method. We'll have a main method class, right? There you can use your IOC container. So the container is an embedded container. IOC containers are embedded containers. One is Bean Factory, right? One is Bean Factory. Generally, we will not use this very core container. And the one is application context. This is a J2W container. In general, we will use this because all the features are given in this container. This is like an advanced container. This is very core container. We go with advanced container. These two are container classes, embedded container classes, Bean Factory, application context. We call them IOC containers. Those two are embedded containers. They came along with your jar files only. You need not to download anything separately. So anyway, you need to configure that embedded container here. So if it is application context, you need to use application context here, and you need to load your XML here. Whatever number of XMLs, right? Application can have multiple XMLs also. You can configure multiple XMLs here. If you have 10 XML files for your application, you can configure it. Okay, any number of XML files we can have. There is no limitation for that. Okay, so now once you're loading this XMLs here, this XML file here, what it will do from that XML file, it will parse the XML file. Your IOC container will do what? This container first it will parse your XML file. Parsing means it will read and it will validate it. So when you try to execute this step, right, it will read your XML and it will try to parse your XML file. It will read what is A, what is B, what is C, what is B, and what is E. It will read all the classes from your XML tags. It will parse and it will read the all the classes. And at runtime, right? At runtime only this will happen. Okay, when actually this XML is going to load into your main method when you run it only, right? So when we run this application, when we run the main method, so at runtime, your XML will be read. So if you configure XML file properly with all the given XML tags, so instead of putting your own tags or instead of doing spelling mistakes, right? If you configure properly this XML file, if you configure it properly, okay, if you configure this XML properly, here it once you load, right, when you run it, the application properly will execute. Otherwise, if you configure wrong tags here, you will get errors here. You will get errors while parsing. It will say the parsing error, so and so XML tag is not there, but you have utilized something. Errors you will get here. Okay, so you need to use proper XML tags. Proper XML tags you need to use. Then you need to load that XML here. Okay, whenever you load it, first it will pass your XML and it will pass, who will pass your container only. Your container will read XML and it will pass it and it will create objects first. A class object, B class object, C class, whatever number of classes, right? A application means it can have any number of classes. All your POSO classes objects it will create. So as we understand from our previous session, your IOC containers will create objects. They'll create objects first. Create objects. All your classes objects will be created first. Your A class, B class, C class, D class, E class. Whatever number of POSO classes your application is having, right? All that POSOs objects, which are configured in XML file. Consider you have something 5 classes, you configured only 4 classes in Spring XML file. It will create only 4 classes objects as you didn't configure your other POSO in XML. So whatever you configured in POSO, all that POSOs objects will be created. Whatever POSOs you configured in XML, all that objects will be created. That is the first step your IOC container will do. That is the first step your IOC container will do. It will create objects. Once after creation of object, once after creation of object, you can do dependency injection. There is one more great feature from container we have. You can do dependency injection. We don't have this feature before in any other framework. Okay, dependency injection. So it will do dependency injection. IOC will do dependency injection. DA means dependency injection. Dependency injection. So it will do dependency injection to your POSO classes. Into POSO classes. Dependency injection required to whom? Your POSOs only. Dependency injection means what? Your POSO classes. Here you have written your POSO classes A, B, C, D, E. Consider I have a request here. This is the user. Here I have a user. Here I have a user. Okay. So here I have a user Akash. Here I have a user Akash. Or I have a user Ravi. Right? So these users came to their browsers and they submitted some data here. So they submitted for doing registration. They submitted data here. Akash opened one browser and he submitted, and Rakesh opened one browser and he submitted. For Akash and Ravi, so this is the flow to whomever they requested, right? For them, first it need to execute A class, then B class, then C, D, E. So it need to start with A and it should end with E. So when the execution started here, Akash requested some data I want to process through A class first. Okay, anyway, A object, B object, C, D objects created by your IOC container only. So comfortably, this user could able to call A class. But if A class wants to call B class, so this B class object you required here. So this B class object you required here. So if you do that manual object creation before calling B class method, if you do this object creation manually here, what will happen? When Akash requested, one object will created, and when again Ravi requested, one more object will created, and again when Karan requested, one more object created. This is how it will create multiple objects when users request it. So if I do it, manual object creation. So as container is already creating objects, right? A, B, C, D, E. Why I should create this object here again? Can't I consume this container created object? Can't I use this B class object which container created? You can do that. So whatever dependency you have, right? Whatever other class dependency you have, create that class dependency with a reference. Create that class name with required reference name. Reference name like B or whatever it is. Okay. Put a reference name here. Okay. Create a dependency here with a setter method. So whatever dependency you have, right, create the dependency and put a setter method for that. That's it. And B class is having C class dependency. Create C class dependency in B class with a setter method. Create C class is having B class dependency. So C class is having B class reference with a setter method. And again D is having E class reference with E class setter method. And E doesn't have any dependency as this is the end layer. So now if you create this setter methods, what will happen? First container, as I said, container will do what? It will create objects, right? It will create all your objects. A, B, C, D, E objects will create at the time of startup. When you run your application, it will create objects, A class, B class, C class, D class objects. Once after creation of objects, if it see any dependencies, right? If it see any dependencies, so this is the dependency with a setter method. In a D class, I have E dependency. If it see any dependencies to other classes, what it will do? It will do the dependency injection also. So if you have any dependency in your class, you need not to create that dependency object directly. You can do dependency injection from your XML only. In XML file, we do that configuration. We do mapping E class into D class, D class into C class, C into B, B into A. So this dependency, these dependencies we pass in XML only, so that whatever the other class dependency you will have read, that class IOC container will supply. You need not to create. Now when Akash request or Ravi request or any other users request, 1,000 users, let them request here. Whatever object it have here, that object is having a B class dependency. Using that B class dependency, that user could able to call B class methods, and B class is having C class dependency. He can able to call C class methods. C can able to call D class. C can able to call D class, and D can able to call E class methods. So this is how dependency will help us to inject other class objects, into each other. Why? Because there are dependency classes. One class need to call another class. This is how we implement. When application means application will have multiple classes, and each class will have other class dependency. So we generally call them like, consider A like a controller. We call it a first one as controller, then next to service, then next to DAO, and repository classes, and if we have any connection pool kind of classes. So each one is dependent to another class. Each one is dependent to another class. So first these classes objects it will create, then as they have dependency on each other, dependency injection also it will do. So why I am calling these are dependencies? Because without this class I cannot able to proceed here, right? I have a mobile phone but I don't have SIM card. Can't I able to call to anyone? I can't, because the SIM card is dependency. So if I have SIM card, then I can able to call any mobile number. So if you consider the same scenario, A is mobile phone, B is SIM card. Without inserting SIM card into mobile, you cannot able to call any numbers. Similar way, here this B class dependency you need to pass into A class so that your A class could able to call B class. Similarly, B class is having dependency of C, then you need to pass that here. So wherever you have dependency, you need to supply that dependency. That dependency injection also your IOC container can do into your POSO class any dependency. You can have any dependency. That dependency you can supply. Okay. So the primarily focus is another class dependency. Generally, in general, to execute your application flow, one class should call another class methods. So that another class object is a dependency for our class. A class is having B class dependency, B is having C dependency, C is having D dependency. As because A should call B class methods, B should call C class methods, C should call D class methods, and D E class methods. Okay, your IOC container can do the dependency injection also. Okay, so we will see how to do that. Okay, we will see how to do that. In how many ways we can do this. Dependency injection. Dependency injection, you can do it through one is setter method dependency injection, setter method dependency injection, and we have constructor dependency injection. Constructor dependency. You can do dependency injection using these two approaches, setter method and constructor. I'll give a simple example. Okay, I will give a simple example how to do this dependency injection using setter or constructor. Okay, setter or constructor. Okay, so consider I have a class here. I'm not going to create a big application. I'll have a simple class. I have a simple class here. So here I have a class, public class, something fuel class. I have fuel. Okay, like petrol, diesel, right? CNG, a fuel class I have. This fuel class is having dependency, private string. A simple dependency I have, primitive dependency only. Okay, I'm not talking about even objects. I have a simple fuel type dependency. Okay, fuel type I have as a dependency, which means I need this value, fuel type value. I can hard code it here. I can hard code it here. Fuel type petrol or diesel, I can configure it here, petrol or diesel. Okay. So if you hard code, whenever you want to change, you need to edit your class and you need to do the change. But instead of hard coding either petrol or diesel here, instead of hard coding, you can supply this value from XML file. That is what we are calling dependency injection. Okay. So instead of hard coding anything, you can pass that from XML file. So here you can have a setter method, public void set fuel type, right? Set fuel type, string fuel type. So input, there is a setter method to take the input. So I need the setter method. The setter method I need to call from my IOC container. IOC container will call it. Okay. So now set the value, whatever your setter method will accept from IOC, that value you can set into this fuel type, into my instance variable. This value, whatever IOC container will supply, I will assign here. Okay. So fuel class I have, fuel class is having a dependency, which is fuel type. Okay. So if something you have here, and if you want to pass the value from XML file, you can call it as dependency. I have a fuel type. So this is my dependency. I want to pass this value from XML file. If you want to pass this value from XML file, you need either setter method or a constructor. Okay. So I have a setter method, set fuel type. Using this setter method, I can able to supply a value here. And this value I'm assigning to this value, right? I'm assigning this value here to my instance variable. Okay. So as this is dependency, When you have something here, and if it is dependency for you, this is dependency. If it is dependency for you, you need to create a setter method. Now, this setter method you can call from your XML file. You know, right, how to configure bean class. You will have a XML file. You will have a Spring XML file. So here in this XML file, we will put DTD or schema just for validation purpose, for your XML validation. Now here we configure our bean class. Bean ID, keep some ID for your bean. All right, fill here, and our class name, fully qualified path. So if it is there in a package beans, beans.fill, give the fully qualified path, including package name. Otherwise, your class will not be recognized. Then close bean. Right? So whenever you want to call another class setter method, what you should do, you need to create that class object fill equal to new fill, and you need to call f dot setter method, set fill type, and you can pass whatever method you have, right? You can call by creating object, and you can supply value here, petrol, diesel, or whatever it is. So to call this setter method, first thing what I'm doing, I'm creating this object. Then next I'm calling setter method. So in general, in Java, this is how we will create. Now, to avoid this, right, Spring itself is providing support to creating object. So you need not create this object manually. So when you configure using bean tag, so this will create object this way. So whatever code we have, right, PLF equal to new PL, the same meaning. So this is your reference and this is your class. By using this one, it will create object. So this first line is avoided. And the second line, I want to call setter method and I want to pass petrol. So to call setter method here, they given a tag name called property. Property means setter method. What is your setter method? Setter method name. You need to give your setter method name here. My setter method name is set field type. You need not to give a full name. Give field type. So this will call your setter method set field type. It will call set field type. Property means set field type. It will call set field type. And I want to pass petrol. So you need to pass that one as a value. There is an attribute name called value in XML. So there you can pass your required value. Petrol or diesel, whatever you want. So this is how you can call setter method. Okay. To call a setter method, this is how you can use property tag, and you can pass your values here. You can pass your values here. So when you call this property will do what internally it will call your setter method. So this property will call setter method, and this value, whatever value we have here, right? This value will be supplied here. This value will be supplied. Okay. So now this tag also avoided. You need not to call this setter manual. So this property tag is something like this. Internally it will call set field type, and it will pass whatever value you have given here. This value it will pass. Whatever value you have given here, this value will be passed. So we avoided programmatic approach. So there is a poso class. There is a poso class PL. There is a poso class PL, and this poso class object created here using bean tag, and this poso class setter method called using property tag. But who will do this, and when this will happen? This will happen at runtime. When you load your XML into IOC, right? There it will happen, right? You know how to do that, right? We know how to do that. We need to have a application class with a main method, public static void main, string args. Here you need to load your XML using application context. use application context, new class path, XML, application context. So use this code to load your XML file. Just you need to configure string.xml, whatever XML path you have, that XML path you need to give here. That's it. Now your application is ready. Your application is ready. Your application is ready for execution. When you do this, right, what will happen when you do this? When you start this main method, here it is loading your XML file, whatever XML configurations you have, right? Here you are loading it. Internally, your IOC container will do what? It will create objects for your fuel class, and it will call setter method, and this value, whatever petrol or diesel, it will be supplied there. So if you want to see whatever value you have supplied, have a getter method here, and you can read it. We know, right, how to do that. Let's do this setter method example here, right? Step by step we will go. Create a Java project, go to Eclipse, new project, Java project. Okay, go to file, new, go to file, new project, Java project, name anything, IOC setter, finish. So first thing, create a project. Next, right click, build path, configure build path, add external jars. As I said, for IOC, we have only two jar files, Spring Core and Spring Context. Spring Core jar file, Spring Context. There is a Beans jar also, add this one. And there is a Commons login. Mostly these four jar files would be enough. Okay. If you want to add all the jars also, no issue, you can add. Okay. There is no such restriction. Now I have a Pozo class. Generally, application will have multiple Pozos based on number of views we have. We will have for each view controller, service, DAO, right? Multiple classes we can have, but we will see that end-to-end applications later. So now I am creating a Pozo class here. Beans, a Pozo class. Fuel, right? Fuel Pozo. So my fuel class is having dependency of private string fuel name or fuel type. Okay, set the fuel name. So this is my dependency, and this dependency and I want to supply through this set fuel name. Okay, so create XML file here, create a package, resources, and create a XML. So this is standard configuration, right? We will have schema first or DTD here. Then XML main root tag is beans. In between beans and beans only, the complete configurations we will have. So here configure your bean ID, field class, bean ID, bean class, fully qualified path. It is there in a package name called beans.fuel. Yeah, this fuel class is there. Now I want to call setter method. So to call setter method, this setter method you want to call, right? You need to have a property tag here, property. And what is the setter method name? Set fuel name. So you need not to give full name here, set fuel name, just give fuel name. It will call your setter method and pass value. So what value you want to pass into fuel name, you can pass that value here. Okay. So first you need to create this bean and you need to call setter method, set fuel name, pass here. So I want to set diesel. Okay, fine. So diesel value will be supplied here. If you want to check that whether it is passing the value or not, you can put here. IOC injecting value, you can print here. IOC injecting value, right? Print here if you want. Fuel name. Okay. Now load this it into application class. Application context, class path XML application context, pass your XML file path. That's it. Run this now. Okay. So as this is new version, Spring ASM libraries also it is asking here. Spring expression library. If it is Spring 2.5, only that 3 jar files would be enough, as this is latest version, right? It is asking multiple jar files. I included all the jars. Okay, run this now. IOC injecting value diesel. See, it is calling setter method and diesel input it is given. I supplied here through XML a diesel input to setter method. My setter method set field name. So here I have this statement. Who called this? I didn't call anywhere. When you load this XML into your IOC container created this object and it is calling the setter method. It called your setter method and the value which you have given here, this value is applied there, right? So first what your IOC container did here is it created your POSO class. When you load your XML, you created your POSO, you created your POSO class and you configured it into XML. And finally, you have loaded this into IOC. When you load this into IOC, when you start your IOC container, what is happening? Fuel class configured here as a bean. You configure your fuel as a bean here. You configure your fuel bean here. So when you load your Spring XML file, and when you start this, when you call start, first thing it will create your fuel class object. So it will create fuel class object. Runtime, right? Object will be created at runtime. Fuel class object is created with F reference. We used F, right? So with F reference, fuel object created with empty value, right? Fuel name with empty fuel name, it is created here. So when you call setter method, right? Here we have setter method also. IOC will do what? First it will create fuel name, and here you have given diesel. Diesel as an input. What IOC will do? It will call setter method of your object. Okay. So whatever setter method you have, right? Using that setter method, it will pass fuel name here. It will pass fuel name here. So using setter method, it will pass fuel name here. Now your object is ready. with the value. So who will do this object creation and dependency injection? Your IOC container will do. Whenever you start, it will create object, and then by calling setter method, it will pass the value. So the same thing happened here. This field class I configured into my XML by calling the setter method. When I start it, what's happening? Created my field class object first and calling the setter method next, and it supplied given value. I have given diesel here, then it is supplied. So if I pass petrol here, petrol will be given. So the advantage is what here, as I have dependency injection, through XML file, I can do or I can change my configurations at any time. At any time, I can change my dependencies. My fuel class is not directly depending on any fuel. But if you hard code this here, something petrol, only your fuel is allowed petrol only. So if you consider this fuel is petrol pump, okay. So if you configure this as a petrol pump, so into that petrol pump fuel name, if you configure, if it is a petrol pump, if you configure petrol only, the petrol pump will supply only petrol. But if you want to supply CNG, and if you want to supply other gas, and if you want to supply diesel also, you cannot do that when you hard code that here. But if you can able to pass something from here, you could able to pass it. You can create any number of beans, right? One is with petrol and one is with diesel. F1, F2, and I'm creating one more bean with the diesel. Now run this. How many objects it will create? Let me override a default constructor also for your understanding sake, to understand how many objects it will create. Fuel object. So I configured this fuel two times. One fuel with petrol and one fuel with diesel. Run this now. Fuel object created and used petrol in the dependency injection. One more fuel object created and using diesel. So this is how your bean class you can configure any number of times with the different configurations. So that is the beauty, right? If you hard coded here, then what is the use? You need to use only whatever you hard coded. If you hard coded with petrol here, only petrol. You create your bean any number of times, it will use petrol only. But instead of hard coding using dependency injection, I could able to supply the value from here. So that's why I can create this bean any number of times with the required inputs. You understand, right? The dependency injection beauty is you can change your configuration whenever you don't want the existing configuration. You can change it, or else if you want to add a new configuration, you can add it.
Sir,
If you
I
have,
have one question.
hmm,
Suppose can we bin ID F1 class bin file beans dot fuel property name fuel name value petrol. Again, we can pass the same here diesel petrol CNG like that. This line.
again, you want to call property tag.
Can we pass multiple value in the property value?
Multiple values as it is a single field, right?
Yeah.
This is single field, one string. How many values you can pass if it is a single string?
Many multiple.
No. This is string, right? Simple string. This is not array.
Okay, okay, got it.
Got it, right? So if you want array of values, you can pass. That is the next concept, okay? I'll show one by one. First, I want to
Okay,
make you understand what is the dependency injection and what is the benefit with that, okay?
okay,
So here, as I said, all classes are POSO classes, right? Once
yes.
done with the string, you are going to implement all your classes as POSOs only. Your classes can have some dependencies, as I said, in real time, right? you will have other class dependencies. Most of the times you will have other class dependencies. Not only other class dependencies, you might have some configuration dependencies also. Here I took something, a simple example, PL name, but in real example, right? Let's say if it is a connection pool class, connection pool class may have the dependency of driver name, URL, username, password. So you can declare that all the properties here for creating connection. Okay. So all that properties you can supply through setter method also. You can pass that values here. Let's say you have Oracle database. Oracle database properties you can pass here. MySQL database properties you can pass here. DB2 databases you can properties you can pass here. So that your DO class is capable to create connection object for any database, as you didn't hard coded that. Okay. So through simple example, what I understand here, my Pozo class is having field name dependency. This field name I can change in my XML file because I'm using dependency injection concept. So dependency injection is helping us by calling the setter method of this class. By calling my class setter method, it could able to supply whatever value I have given here. So dependency injection means what in layman term, right? Dependency injection meaning is passing required values or giving the required values to Pozo class or passing required values to Pozo class. If your Pozo class is having any required values, that values I can pass from my XML file. That is what a dependency injection definition. My Pozo class is having one dependency value field tag, field name that I am passing from here. Okay, that's what you can call dependency injection. Passing required values from XML we call dependency injection. So to achieve this dependency injection, we have two types. One is setter dependency injection. As I said, one is setter dependency injection. Using setter method, you can able to pass values. So to call setter method, we have property tag that we use. And there is one more approach, a parameterized constructor also you can use. There is one more approach, parameterized constructor also we can use, that we will discuss later. Okay, that we will discuss later. And let's see what will happen. So in one bean itself, let me remove all these beans. So if you have three beans configured here, three objects will be created. If you configure three beans, three objects will be created. Fuel object 1 for petrol, fuel object 2 for diesel, fuel object 3 for CNG. So as many objects you want to create, you can create that many objects here, right? But ID should be unique. You should not repeat this ID again and again. If you repeat, it will throw unique ID, something exception. ID should not duplicate. Okay, your ID should not duplicate, though you have these configurations in multiple XML files, not only one XML. You can create multiple XMLs here. Spring XML file, Spring 2 XML file, I'll create Spring 3 XML file. So in Spring 2 XML file, in Spring 1 XML file, I have petrol. Okay. So in Spring XML file, I have petrol. Remove the remaining diesel properties. In Spring 2 XML file, remove petrol and CNG. And in Spring 3 XML file, only put CNG. So I have three configurations. Okay, consider developer 1 is working on this one XML file, developer 2 is working on Spring 2, developer 3 working on Spring 3 XML file. Though three developers are working on multiple XMLs also, they should not duplicate this ID. If they duplicate this ID, what will happen? Unique IDs it will accept, so it will throw exception. So now I have three XMLs, right? You can load three XMLs files here. Okay, resources, you can pass array of XMLs here, array of config locations. You can pass array of config locations. How to pass string array? String array you can pass here. So multiple XMLs. Spring XML file, one XML file, no, two XML file, and three XML. Load as many as you have. So Spring 2, Spring 3, 3 XMLs I have. Now I loaded 3 XMLs. Any number of XMLs you can load. Run it. Again, same behavior. It loaded all the XMLs. It loaded all your XML files. It will load it all your XML files and all the objects creating. From XML1, petrol injected. From 2, diesel injected. From 3, CNG injected with different objects. I created 3 fuel objects separately. So as I have 3 different IDs, 3 objects it is created. What if I use the same ID, F1? Here, I duplicated F1. In Spring XML also I have F1. In Spring 2 XML also I have F1. If you load it, what is happened here? Petrol object not created. Okay, petrol object created but overridden. So Spring 2 it used to throw unique ID exceptions from 3 onwards. It is overriding it. So do this configuration in one XML file. F1 again F1. Okay. In one XML file, it is not allowing. XML itself throwing error. Attribute F1 of ID must be unique within the document. So within the document, it is asking unique one. If I still keep it there and run it, it is throwing exception. So your XML is not allowing. Okay. So when you want to duplicate it, the duplication is allowing in other XML file, not here. But what is happening? What is happening is it is creating only one object, the latest configuration. So the petrol I think overridden with the diesel object. So only diesel object and CNG object created. Petrol object gone. The latest configuration loaded. So only diesel object and CNG objects created. Because this ID I duplicated in another XML file. Okay. So correction here, when you have multiple XMLs, right? You can duplicate this ID, but what is happening? Whatever the ID you have in first loading XML, right? This is overriding with this configuration. Okay, this configuration is overriding here. So that means this configuration will not work as a latest XML, latest loading XML, right? So if you see the order, so first this XML loading. So whatever configuration we have in this XML, that XML configuration overriding with Spring 2 configuration. Okay. So be careful if you want to use same IDs. So you need to consider that it's okay, it will override. So if you don't want to override, keep different IDs so that it will not override.
Hi, sir.
Yeah.
I have one question. Since
Yeah.
we have it as a singleton, that's why it is happening, or if we will change it to prototype, then it will create different objects, those two?
Yeah. So as we discussed, all the beans are singletons. We thought all the beans are singletons. So throughout the container, one object only should be created. Correct. So I configured fuel object with F1. So only one object will be created for F1. But for F2, one more object will be created. But for F3, one more object will be created. So as it is singleton also, I configured 3 beans, 3 times it will create. But when you call here multiple times, right, get bean of ap dot get bean of, now here if you call F1 10 times also, no issue. F1, F2, F3, as they are singleton objects, they'll create only one time. So one object only one time with this ID, one time only created. Though you call multiple times, Ashok called, Ravi called, let them call any number of users. Call the fuel one object for petrol. So it will create only one object, one petrol object. D is like called 3 times. Still, it is created only one object, as because they are singletons. If you change their scope here, we have a scope property singleton to prototype. We change it to prototype. Then for every call, it will create new object. Only for petrol, I'll put prototype. For the remaining beans, it is singleton only. Run it. F1 will be created 3 times. Fuel object, fuel object, fuel object. If you see petrol object created 3 times, because it is prototype. Okay. Now your doubt, this is prototype bean, and if I configure F1, what will happen? As I said, it should override, right? The latest diesel should override the petrol configurations, which are singletons. And there is no F2, right? Even here also I need to call F1, because diesel also, ID also change it to F1. Now run it. See, fuel object created, only diesel, and CNG I can see. This is
No,
called 6 times.
what if we are not calling explicitly in the main file? Like we have created 2 bean ID with the same bean ID value.
Same bean ID, F1 here and F1 here. So the
Yes.
latest loading XML is overriding the previous
Even though
XML.
we are keeping prototype as scope.
Yeah, even is it a it's a singleton or prototype, it is not bothering, it is overriding completely.
Okay.
That's why it is not recommended to this ID. Okay.
Okay.
Somehow if
Yeah.
developers forget, as a developer, right? I checked in Spring XML file and you checked in Spring 2 XML file. Somehow if you configure my ID, my changes gone. My expected behavior will not be there in application. So you should not do that. That's why I'm saying ID should not duplicate it, though you have multiple XML files also. Don't repeat that ID. If you repeat, you saw right what happened. My bean configuration is gone. F1B. Though it is prototype also, that is gone. Understand, right?
Yeah, got it.
Yeah. So yeah. So today what we learned is what is dependency injection. So the dependency injection means passing required values to my poser class. The field name is required value to my poser class. I supplied it through setter method. So to call setter method, I need to use property tag. Property, your setter method name, and value you need to supply. That's it. This is how you can do the dependency injection. And the same thing we did through multiple XML files. You can configure multiple XML files if you want, and load that multiple XML files here using string array of XML files. You can configure here. And finally, when users try to call these beans, even though any number of times they call, it will create only one object, as all my beans are singletons. Okay, so we'll talk about the scopes, I mean regularly. Okay, so there are two scopes, singleton and prototype. Prototype is not required in general, we never use. In case if there is any case, we will use. Okay, we'll talk about in depth of the scopes later. Okay, so that's all for today. Tomorrow we'll show you the complete setter dependency injection of various dependency types. Only string we see now, right? I'll show you how to inject objects, how to inject arrays, how to inject collections, how to inject our custom collection objects. There are challenges, right? How to overcome the challenges, I'll show you. Okay, so till then you just practice with this. Okay, in yesterday, yeah,
As of now, you didn't share the Spring jar file.
jar files.
I shared yesterday. Let me show you.
I didn't get.
Uh,
Okay, so who whoever not getting, right, just reply me here. Yesterday what I did, This email you got, right? Spring. Did everyone get
No,
this?
sir.
No,
I
sir.
No,
sent it.
sir.
To whom then I sent? These are the mail IDs. They confirmed me, right? But
Yes.
then they shared yesterday.
Akash.
Vaibhav, Shravani. But this mail IDs I shared yesterday. You can see, right? Spring 3 RAR file and one IOC example. If not, again I'll share you today. No worries, okay? I'll share you today again. And
Hello, sir.
yeah, yes, I can hear.